creation was groaning. If you could stand on the dusty plains of the ancient world thousands of years ago, the first thing you would notice wasn't the heat or the primitive structures, but the noise. It was a civilization not in its infancy, but in a terrifying, accelerated maturity. They were builders, conquerors, and kings, men of renown who had unlocked the secrets of metal and stone. Cities rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, monuments to human pride that scraped the very heavens. But beneath the marvel of their architecture lay a foundation of rot. The air was thick, not just with the smoke of industry, but with a palpable malice. The scriptures tell us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Imagine that for a moment. Not a single moment of mercy, not a fleeting thought of kindness, just a relentless, grinding hunger for power and pleasure.
The boundaries between the natural and the supernatural had been shattered. The sons of God had taken wives among the daughters of men, birthing a lineage of chaos. Violence wasn't just a crime, it was the currency of the day. The strong devoured the weak, and the weak devoured each other in a desperate bid for survival. And in the heavens, there was a profound, heartbreaking shift. The Creator, the architect of the stars and the breath in our lungs, looked down upon his masterpiece. He saw the violence filling the earth like a rising tide. The Bible records one of the most tragic verses in all of history. And the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. God was not merely angry, he was heartbroken. The intimacy of Eden was gone, replaced by a world that had not only forgotten him, but actively despised him. Yet, in this ocean of darkness, there was a single flicker of light. One man. Noah. Noah was not a superhero. He was a man of the soil, a husband, a father to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But while the world around him ran toward madness, Noah walked with God. This phrase, walked with God, implies a closeness that is almost impossible to comprehend in such a hostile environment. Imagine the psychological toll. To be the only one. To wake up every morning in a society that calls your morality foolishness and your faith insanity. To walk through the markets and hear the whispers. To see the bloodshed, and to feel the crushing weight of isolation. Noah had to battle the same doubts we face today. Am I the crazy one? Is God really speaking? Or is this just the silence of the desert? But Noah didn't just believe in God. He knew him. He cultivated a quiet space in his soul where the noise of the world couldn't reach. Then came the day that changed history. The day the silence broke. The timeline was ticking.
The Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. The countdown had begun, though the world was deaf to the ticking clock. Noah went to the mountain, seeking the presence of the Almighty, perhaps seeking refuge from the violence below. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying the dust of a dying age. And then the voice came. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a decree. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth." The words must have hit Noah like a physical blow. The total annihilation of everything he had ever known. The markets, the cities, the neighbors, the distant relatives, all of it washed away. A lesser man might have argued, A lesser man might have crumbled under the terror of such a revelation. But God was not finished.
He offered a lifeline, a chaotic, impossible blueprint for salvation. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. The instructions were precise, mathematical, and terrifyingly massive. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. To put this in perspective, this was not a boat, it was a floating fortress. Longer than a modern football field, taller than a 3-story building, and the context is crucial here. They were nowhere near the ocean. God continued, outlining the design rooms, nests for animals, pitch to seal it inside and out, a window, a door in the side, lower, second, and third decks. It was an engineering project that would require decades of labor, vast resources, and an expertise that Noah likely didn't possess at the start. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flood in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die.
The word flood, or Mabul in Hebrew, described a cataclysm never before seen. Until this point in history, it is possible that rain as we know it, violent torrential storms, had never occurred. The earth was watered by mists and rivers. Noah was being asked to prepare for a disaster he couldn't even visualize, to defend against a weapon he couldn't comprehend. But God established his covenant. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And then the logistical impossibility. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Birds, cattle, creeping things. The sheer scope of this command creates a sense of vertigo. How? How would he gather them? How would he feed them? How would he control them? The task was destined to fail by human standards. It was a setup for humiliation. Noah stood on that mountain, the blueprint of humanity's survival etched into his mind. He looked down at the valley where the smoke of the violent cities rose. He had a choice. He could go back down, blend in, and enjoy the remaining years of his life in relative comfort. Or he could destroy his reputation, drain his resources, and dedicate the next century of his life to building a giant wooden box in the middle of nowhere, based on a voice that no one else heard. This is where the juxtaposition of human weakness and divine power begins. Noah didn't have an army. He had a family. He didn't have advanced machinery. He had gopher wood and pitch. He didn't have the support of his culture. He had the promise of a grieving God. The scripture simply says, "Thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did." He went down the mountain. He gathered his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He told them the news. One can only imagine the silence at the dinner table that night. The look in his wife's eyes, the fear, the confusion. "Father, are you sure? The whole world?" But they trusted him because they saw the change in his countenance. They saw the fear of the Lord in his eyes, which outweighed the fear of men. The construction began. The first tree was felled. The sound of the axe striking wood was the first note of a funeral dirge for the ancient world, though no one else knew it yet. Day after day, year after year, the structure began to rise, a ribcage of timber appearing in the wasteland. And with the construction came the critics. At first it was curiosity. Travelers would stop staring at the massive skeleton of the ship. Then the curiosity turned to confusion, and finally, to mockery. The text implies a world full of violence and arrogance. They wouldn't just ignore Noah. They would make him a spectacle. "What is this, old man? A boat for the sand? Has your God told you to sail on the dust?" The psychological pressure intensified.
It wasn't just a week of insults. It was decades. Imagine raising your children while the entire society screams that you are insane. Imagine the nights where Noah lay awake, listening to the dry wind, wondering if he had hallucinated the whole thing. But then he would remember the grief in God's voice. He would remember the covenant. And the next morning, he would pick up a hammer as the ark neared completion. The shadow it cast grew longer, a physical judgment looming over the land. The pitch was applied, black and sticky, sealing the vessel against the wrath to come. The structure was sound. The granaries were filled. The work was done. And then, the waiting ended. The atmosphere shifted. A strange instinct rippled through the animal kingdom, from the forests, the deserts, and the skies. They began to come, not driven by man, but drawn by the Creator. A procession of life marching toward the only safety left on earth. The stage was set. The door was open. The sky was still blue, but the clock had run out.
The sight defied all logic. From the edges of the wilderness they came, lions moving with a heavy, predatory grace, yet docile, their aggression suspended by a command etched into their very instincts. Elephants, their massive frames stirring the dust, birds darkening the sky like a living cloud. They ascended the ramp, 2 by 2, a procession of life orchestrated by the unseen hand of the Creator. The crowd gathered around the construction site watched in stunned silence. The mockery died in their throats, replaced by a cold, creeping unease. For years, they had laughed at the old man's architecture, but they could not laugh at this. This was not engineering. This was dominion. The natural world was obeying a signal that human ears were too deaf to hear. Noah stood at the threshold. His work was finished. The last beam was set, the last bucket of pitch applied. He looked out at the world one last time, the familiar hills, the distant cities, the faces of his neighbors. He must have felt a crushing weight of sorrow. He knew what was coming. He knew that the ground beneath their feet, solid and dependable for millennia, was about to betray them. "Come," he urged his family. "It is time." Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with their wives and Noah's wife, stepped across the threshold. They left behind the sunlight, the open air, and the society that had rejected them. They stepped into the dim, cavernous belly of the ark, the air thick with the scent of hay, timber, and animal musk. Then, the most chilling moment of the entire age occurred. The scriptures tell us that Noah did not close the door. It was too heavy, too final for human hands. And the Lord shut him in. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the valley as the massive timber door slammed shut, sealed by the divine will. It was the sound of an era ending. Outside, the people stood before the sealed vessel. Perhaps some pounded on the wood, shouting, making jokes to hide their fear. Or perhaps they simply shrugged, returning to their feasts and their violence, convinced that the clouds gathering above were just another passing storm. But this was no ordinary storm. It began not with a sprinkle, but with a collapse. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, tearing through the trees and whipping the sand into a frenzy. And then the first drop fell, heavy, cold, and stinging. Then another, and another. Within moments, the heavens tore open. The Bible describes this cataclysm with terrifying precision. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, This wasn't just rain. The earth itself was fracturing. Massive subterranean aquifers, held under pressure since the dawn of time, burst forth with the force of 1,000 geysers. The ground cracked and heaved. Water shot up from below to meet the torrent crashing down from above. It was a chaotic collision of the waters above and the waters below, undoing the very work of creation on the second day. Inside the ark, the sensation must have been terrifying. The ground, which had been their stable foundation, lurched. The massive vessel groaned, the wood straining against the rising pressure. For the first time, the ark wasn't just a building. It was a ship. It lifted. Imagine the sensory overload inside that dark wooden womb. The roar of the rain was deafening, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out all conversation. The animals, sensing the upheaval, would have been restless, their calls mixing with the thunder. The lantern light flickered as the floor tilted. Noah and his family held on, their knuckles white. They were floating on the death of a world. Outside, the panic was absolute. The valleys flooded first, sweeping away the livestock and the homes. People fled to higher ground, scrambling up the hillsides, their arrogance washed away by the rising tide. The kings and the conquerors, who had boasted of their power, were now reduced to desperate refugees clawing at the mud. They looked toward the ark, bobbing violently on the churning waves, a dark silhouette against the lightning. But the door was shut. The time of grace had passed. The time of judgment had arrived. For 40 days and 40 nights the assault continued. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only a perpetual gray twilight of water and fury. The peaks of the mountains, the last refuges of the condemned, were swallowed. The noise of the destruction eventually faded, not because the storm ceased, but because there was nothing left to destroy. The cities were gone, the monuments were gone. The breath of life, in all its corruption and beauty, was extinguished from the face of the earth. And then the rain stopped. The silence that followed must have been heavier than the storm. For 150 days the waters prevailed. The ark drifted aimlessly over a planetary ocean. There was no rudder, no sail, no navigation. Noah was not the captain of this ship. He was merely a passenger. God was the pilot. Inside the ark, a new struggle began, the struggle of the mind. The adrenaline of the crisis faded, replaced by the crushing routine of survival. Feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, checking the stores. The darkness was oppressive. The smell was pungent. And the questions must have haunted them in the quiet hours. Are we truly safe? What if the water never goes down? Has God forgotten us? Scripture says, God remembered Noah. It doesn't mean he forgot. It means he turned his attention toward action. He caused a wind to pass over the earth. A dry, invisible force began to push back the chaos. The waters began to recede, a slow, agonizing process. The ark shuddered as it made contact with solid ground. It came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. They were grounded, but they were still imprisoned. They could not see the world outside. The window, their only connection to the heavens, revealed nothing but the sky. Noah, needing to know if the judgment had passed, opened the window. He sent out a raven. The black bird flew out, its wings beating against the damp air. It went to and fro, a scavenger comfortable in the desolation, feeding on the floating carrion, finding no reason to return. It was a symbol of the old world, restless, unclean, surviving on death. Then Noah sent out a dove. The dove, a creature of purity, flew over the vast expanse of water. She found no resting place for the sole of her foot. The world was still hostile, still submerged in judgment. She returned to the ark, and Noah, in a moment of tender compassion, reached out his hand and pulled her back inside. He waited 7 more days.
The waiting was the hardest part. To be so close to freedom, yet still trapped. He sent the dove out again. The hours ticked by. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Anxiety mounted. Had she perished? Was there no hope? And then, a silhouette against the twilight, the flutter of wings. The dove returned. But she did not come back empty-handed. In her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was a small thing, a fragile piece of greenery. But to Noah and his family, it was everything. It was proof that the trees had survived. It was proof that the water was receding. It was proof that life had found a way to push through the death. The earth was breathing again. Noah waited another 7 days and sent the dove out a 3rd time. This time, she did not return. She had found a home. The world was ready. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked. The sunlight hit his face, unfiltered and warm. He saw the ground, cracked, dry, and silent. The chaotic ocean was gone, replaced by a landscape scoured clean. It was a new world. The ancient civilizations were erased. The history of violence was buried under layers of sediment. It was a blank canvas. But Noah didn't rush out. He had learned the lesson of the flood well. He moved only when God spoke. He stood at the threshold of a new age, waiting for the command to step into the unknown.
And then God spoke. "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you." The doors that had been sealed by the Almighty were now thrown open. Can you imagine that first step? For over a year, Noah and his family had walked on wood, surrounded by the smell of containment and the constant, rhythmic swaying of the waves. Now, his foot pressed into the dirt. It was firm. It was solid. The air wasn't thick with the humidity of the storm anymore. It was crisp, clean, and smelling of raw, new life. The silence of the desolate earth was broken by a sudden, joyous eruption of noise. The animals were released. It must have been a spectacle of chaotic freedom. Horses galloping down the ramp, their hooves thundering on the rocky slopes. Birds exploding into the sky, filling the empty heavens with color and song. Sets that had been cooped up in the dark, blinking in the brilliant sunshine, scattering to the 4 corners of the new world to multiply and fill the earth. But Noah did not run. He did not immediately stake out land for a house or plant a vineyard for his comfort. His first act in this new world was not one of survival, but of worship. The scriptures say, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took of the clean animals and the clean birds, resources that were incredibly precious, considering they were the only stock left on earth, and he offered them as a burnt offering. He gave back to God the very thing God had saved for him. Smoke curled up into the azure sky, a pillar of gratitude rising from a cleansed planet, and the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. It wasn't the smell of burning meat that pleased God. It was the heart of the man who offered it. It was the scent of faith. In that moment, the Creator made a profound decision. He said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done." God looked at the vulnerability of man and chose mercy. He established the rhythm of the earth that we rely on to this day. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. And then, God signed his name to the promise. He told Noah to look up. Against the retreating dark clouds, where the sunlight pierced through the lingering moisture, a phenomenon appeared. A bow, a rainbow. In ancient times, a bow was a weapon of war. It was an instrument of death. But observe the shape of the rainbow. It is a bow unstrung. It is a weapon hung up against the wall, its curve pointing not down at the earth in judgment, but up into the heavens. God was saying, "The war is over. My wrath has been spent. I have hung up my weapon." It was a covenant of peace, a visual guarantee that the waters would never again consume the globe. So, what does the story of Noah mean for us, right here, right now? It is easy to look at this narrative as just a children's story, a boat, a zoo, and a rainbow. But if we look closer, we see a mirror of our own lives. We live in a world that often feels like it is drowning. Maybe not in water, but in anxiety, in noise, in moral confusion, and in fear. We look at the news and we see the violence. We look at our own hearts and we feel the rising tide of stress and helplessness. We feel like the storm is raging and there is no solid ground left to stand on. But the story of Noah tells us that judgment is real, but so is grace. Noah wasn't saved because he was perfect. He was saved because he trusted the architect. He was saved because when God said, "Get in," he got in. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ is often compared to the ark. Just as the ark was the only vessel of safety in a world of judgment, Jesus is the only vessel of safety for the human soul. The ark was made of wood. The cross was made of wood. The ark was covered in pitch to keep the judgment out. We are covered in the blood of Christ to keep the judgment away. Noah had to go through a door to be saved. Jesus said, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." Perhaps you are in a season of waiting right now. You feel like you are stuck in the boat. The storm has stopped, but the waters haven't receded. You are sending out prayers like Noah sent out the raven, and they seem to return empty. You are wondering if God has forgotten you in the dark. Take heart. God remembered Noah, and he remembers you. The silence is not an absence. It is a pause. He is preparing the ground. He is drying the land. The dove is coming. The olive branch is on its way. The same God who closed the door to keep the waters out is the same God who will open the door when it is time for you to step into your new season. Your job is not to steer the ship. Your job is to trust the pilot. Your job is to remain faithful when the world mocks your faith. So, when you see a rainbow arching across the sky after a summer storm, don't just see a refraction of light. See a promise. See a weapon hung up. See a God who keeps his word from the mountains of Ararat to the struggles of your daily life. The storm will pass. The ground will dry. And you will walk out not just a survivor, but a witness to the saving power of God. By the way, if you find these videos interesting, meaningful, or enjoyable, please consider subscribing. It really helps. And if you'd like to support our mission even further, you can visit our shop or join as a channel member. These videos take a long time to make, and every bit of support helps us continue sharing God's Word through powerful animation. So, be part of the mission.